I'm here today with Jennifer Butler. Jennifer is the founding executive director of Faith in Public Life, which works to change the narrative about the role of faith in politics, wins major policy victories, and empowers religious leaders to fight for the common good. Jennifer is the author of a book entitled Who Stole My Bible? Reclaiming Scripture as Handbook for Resisting Tyranny, which helps readers discover how the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is a liberating handbook for finding your voice for overcoming authoritarianism. She's also the author of Born Again, The Christian Right Globalized, which calls for a religious response to global culture wars of the religious right. Jennifer has also written about progressive faith on Pathos, Sojourners, The Hill, and Religion News Service. Jennifer was the chair of the White House Council on Faith and Neighborhood Partnerships and spent 10 years working in the field of international human rights representing the Presbyterian Church USA at the United Nations. Jennifer also served in the Peace Corps at a Mayan village in Belize. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, Jennifer also studied public policy and community organizing and graduated with an MSW from Rutgers University. She's a graduate of the College in William and Mary and lives in suburban Washington, D.C. So Jennifer, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today.
It's really great to be here, Brian, and I'm so grateful for all your work.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on the new book. Before we started the interview, we were talking about all of the challenges and roadblocks overcome associated with publishing and marketing a book, and you made it, and it's going well, and so that's just a wonderful thing to see.
It is. The progressive faith voice is so critical, and I'm just so glad you're doing so much to get it out there, and we've all got to work together on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we will. So there's a lot of opportunity, I guess we should say there, right?
That's right.
So before we get into the book, maybe you can tell us just a little bit more about your background besides what I touched on briefly there.
Yeah, so I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Bible Belt, and came of age in the 1980s. And really, my spiritual journey is one of really trying to find the real Jesus, in the Bible. I remember coming of age and trying to decide for myself, do I really believe this Christianity that I've grown up with? My family went to church, 3 times a week, and very, very committed to our Methodist church, which was a big mega church of 8,000 members on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia. Really big Southern church, like many of them are. And I was terrified of nuclear Armageddon, of the prospects that we would destroy ourselves. I think, a lot of people don't think about that as much today, although it's still a threat. But it was heightened in the 80s because of the Cold War, and a lot of documentaries coming out about mutual self-destruction that was possible in this age. And I was also really concerned about racism. I had been one of the first generation of kids to actually attend an integrated public school in Atlanta. Although the Supreme Court had desegregated schools in the 1950s, it took 2 decades for us to get around to actually doing that. And I didn't quite realize what a pioneering project that was. I had the benefit of being taught entirely by Black women for the first 6 years of my education.
Wow.
Which totally, I think charted the course of my life. But what I didn't know at the time entirely was that many of our friends and family and neighbors were pulling their children out of public school systems and putting them in private Christian academies and private schools. And so they were sort of de facto desegregating again. And, I didn't understand that fully and have gone back to learn more. But at the time I did hear a lot of racism from some members of my family. And as a child, I was really disturbed by that and trying to figure out how to respond to it. So all of those dynamics are going through my head, and I'm a very angstful teenager coming of age, trying to decide what I believe and praying every night. God, I don't know if you really exist. Do I really believe this for myself, or do I believe it because my parents told me to? And I just remember praying a prayer, in high school saying, God, I don't know if you're there, but I like Jesus. I like what he's saying about bringing good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. And I am going to commit myself to this path. And the basic thing was I committed myself to that Jesus, the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, the Jesus of the least of these, but I really didn't hear that Jesus preached around me. In the 80s, everybody was getting swept behind Ronald Reagan and was becoming increasingly anti-Carter. And I couldn't understand that dichotomy. And so I went on a journey for, many years to find a theology that would express the Jesus I knew. And so that was some of the motivation for writing the book, is my disillusionment with the Christianity I knew, and especially in white churches, and the discrepancy between what I saw preached and what I actually found in the Bible and found as I pursued and committed myself to following Christ myself.
Wow. So, well, you got an amazing background, in Belize, the United Nations, tell us a little bit about those experiences.
Yeah, those were awesome. I've been very fortunate. So in Belize, again, I'm a fairly naive, isolated, white Christian from the South, and I decided to join the Peace Corps. In part, I grew up not knowing, actually being committed to social justice, but actually not having those words in my vocabulary. And I had friends in college, one from Kenya, one from Cameroon, who, I was thinking about becoming a missionary because that's what I knew. Like for me as a evangelical Christian, it was like, I'll become a missionary, right? That's how I go, like, live out my faith. But they really kind of saw me and were like, you should join the Peace Corps. So that's what I up and did, rather than go with Wycliffe Bible translators or some group like that. And it was a real eye opener for me in a really good way. I mean, I had been taught sort of erroneous information about the politics of Latin America, for example, and I got to see firsthand what was happening in places like Guatemala because I lived there and I was able to go to those places and talk to people who were experiencing direct oppression from the United States and the Guatemalan government. And I lived in a little Mayan village and I learned about community organizing from the folks in my village.
Wow. That's quite a place to learn something, isn't it?
It was so great. Here I go in as this white woman thinking, okay, I'm going to help change things, but really I just ended up learning a lot. And there was a village informal leader named Tacho, and he taught me how to organize. Basically, I had started a library because my schools really had no books. Here teachers trying to teach, and there were just no books around for anybody to read. And as we started that, we ended up introducing a really powerful resource into the village. And we had a corrupt village chairman who tried to take over the project and use it for his own ends, his own profit. And so Tacho helped me organize the village to stand against him and to finally throw him out. So that's when I learned the words community organizing. Again, as this person who'd grown up the way I didn't know the words community organizing, but that's what I was born to do. And as I spent time in Latin America, I began to learn that there's this thing called liberation theology. I had never been exposed to that. And so I decided to go to seminary and I was able to study feminist theologies, liberation theologies, and that was much closer theology to the Jesus I knew. It gave me words to express the faith that had always been growing in me. And then when I went to the UN, by the time I reached, I got hired by the Presbyterian Church USA to help represent Presbyterians at the United Nations and shape global policy, and was especially focused on the global women's movement and women's human rights, which was a growing movement and still is. Very exciting movement. And, I had become fairly disillusioned too in seminary. I had a experience of dating violence where a person I was dating who later became a pastor stalked me, and the institution wasn't quite prepared, to help create a safe space for me. I had to really fight to even just stay in seminary. And so I faced a kind of disillusionment with the church. And so here I am entering ministry and doing all this work in theology and human rights. And I'm questioning whether to stay with the church, which is a journey I think so many of us have been on in recent years. And I was at the UN organizing some events around reclaiming scripture as the basis for human rights. And we ended up giving some event space away so that Muslim women could actually talk about what was happening in the Muslim world, particularly with the Taliban and religious extremism. And as we did that, it was a life-changing experience for me because there's a chapel across the street from the UN, and we were using that chapel for this event for Muslim women, which I absolutely loved. And there was no panelist table, so we cleared the granite altar that could not be moved in the front of the sanctuary, and we made that the panelist table. So all the Muslim women are sitting at the altar, and they're speaking to a packed chapel. I was like, this is my faith right here. And midway through, there's a commotion at the door, and there's this great disturbance. And I look over, and the Saudi Arabian delegation has come in with some big, huge guys, their security detail, basically. And you can tell because there are little wires coming out their ear. And the women kind of faltered. They got nervous because clearly this delegation was there to intimidate them, not to speak out. The wise women in that room, the leaders of the global women's movement, immediately stood to their feet and began to applaud these women. And that had the effect of both encouraging the women, but also blocking the door. So the women were able to continue the presentation. And I thought right then and there, damn it, if these women can reclaim their faith against those kinds of odds, then I sure as hell can too. And I shouldn't let anybody take my faith from me just because they've abused it, right?
Wow.
So many times we want to leave because we're thinking, well, this hypocrisy kind of discredits the whole faith. But of course, and this is what I say in the book, tyrants will try to hijack faith because faith is so powerful. Our faith is actually radical, and the Bible is a very radical book that actually gives us the tools of resistance to tyranny. And of course, the powers that be in the world are going to try to hijack that and co-opt it for their own purposes. So I committed myself to getting ordained at that point in the church, or my presbytery, which is the region that kind of governed the church that was seeing me through the ordination process. They literally hired a bus, came up to the United Nations and ordained me right there at the United Nations. Powerful experience for me as a woman to claim my moral authority and to not let anyone take that from me.
But you've got so many great stories, I hope you just write down a lot of those stories if they're not already in the book, because you've got so many good ones.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, one of those is in the book, so maybe I'll do a memoir next. I'm really starting to enjoy writing. I've been an activist for most of my years and an organizer. And yet I've discovered through this process that I have a writer and a storyteller in me. And I really enjoy that. It's very spiritually healing. And it's a joy to watch other people enjoy that and learn from it as well.
Well, so let's talk about the latest book, Who Stole My Bible? Walter Brueggemann said, Butler's writing is personal, imaginative, accessible, and compelling. I found it to be an empowering page turner. That's really a great thing to hear from someone like him. I'm
taking that in again because I love Brueggemann. His work has so inspired me. Yes.
So how did this book come about?
Well, in 2017, we were all in a sense of shock, really, in November 2016 when Donald Trump got elected. And I realized how much I didn't know. I realized how much as a white woman I had missed in terms of racism in America and what we needed to overcome and what we needed to confront. And as I did activism, and we were really putting ourselves out there. We immediately at Faith in Public Life, we organized opposition to what we called the cabinet of bigotry. And those were strong words for any faith group to use. Mostly we don't oppose cabinet appointments and very strong terms, but we quickly had 2,000 faith leaders sign on to that statement. And we did some marches at the Capitol, and we confronted Mitch McConnell and called on members of Congress not to approve the cabinet members, particularly Jeff Sessions, who later was attacking churches and religious groups around our stance on refugees and immigrants. And so we saw what he became. Anyway, so we were leading some really strong work, and I decided to also do civil disobedience around this attack on the Affordable Care Act with Reverend William Barber and Tracy Blackman. And as I did those things, they were at once terrifying and spiritually empowering. And I realized that the way I got courage to take those steps was through the power of scripture. I realized how much I was just really relying on scripture in terms of keeping my orientation in that world, because I think for a lot of us, what happened with Trump was the world as we knew it became sort of like looking through a funhouse mirror. We were like, what the heck is this? What is going on? How do I put my hands around this? What do I do in this moment? Are we really kind of back to, a moment that's like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer moment? And it was scripture that really kept me grounded. And sometimes I would go home, there'd be some verse kind of fragments echoing in my head. And I thank God for Google. I didn't even have to worry about finding a lectionary. And I would Google those phrases and be like, okay, this is what God is saying to me in this moment. This is how I stay grounded. And one of the most powerful moments to me early on, it was, we led a rally that had like 300 clergy. We marched in and stood in front of Paul Ryan's door. It was a locked door. We knew he was in there. He wasn't meeting with any of our faith leaders, refused to meet with us. And so we just, shared our testimonies about healthcare outside his door, and people left their holy texts at the door with stories. And at the end of that action, I was walking away, and there was a woman who looked kind of disoriented and just wide-eyed, and I wasn't sure if she was okay. And so I said, hey, do you need help finding your way back out of this building? Those buildings are like mazes. Do you need anything to eat? Can I help you? And she just looked at me like she was having this amazing epiphany, and she said, I feel like I'm learning to speak for the very first time. I feel like I'm learning to say who I am from a biblical basis and what I stand for. I'm doing great, she said. And then she sort of like stumbled off. And I realized those were the moments that moved my soul the most. I've been an activist for a long time, but to see people like myself reclaim our spiritual voice and our public spiritual voice at that has been the most rewarding for me. And I really believe that that is what this country needs right now, is this very vocal moral movement of all of the faith traditions, not just Christianity, but Christianity has done so much harm because it was co-opted by empire, that we, particularly those of us who are white Christians, really need to reclaim our public faith voice and push back on the narrative of Christian nationalism. So that's why I wrote the book.
Wow, good for you. Good for you. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's just interesting, isn't it, how the kinds of experiences that you've had, physical, in-person experiences, have driven you to, take the other steps, like writing this book that you have.
Yes. Yeah. Very hands-on, very experiential, very practical. And so what I do in the book is first I reimagine the biblical story. I do a bit of midrash. I kind of look behind, over, and around the text and kind of flesh it out in terms of what's happening today. And so I imaginatively retell these stories. And then I do a bit of exegetical work, just exploring the actual text and what scholars say about it. And after that, I apply it to America today. And so it's very current. It's all about what happened during the Trump years. People have asked me, how did you get it to be so current? I really wanted to help people unpack authoritarianism and Christian nationalism in terms of what actually unfolded in our biblical texts, because our biblical texts are all about opposing Pharaoh, opposing Caesar, about when our own religious leaders get co-opted by ethno-nationalist movements, what we should do. And then I conclude by taking out from those texts the spiritual practices and strategies that can help us actually confront authoritarianism today.
Wow. That is so practical, right?
It really is.
Because, and so many pastors, I don't think, are willing to actually go to that kind of depth, to take the specific areas of the Bible and really describe how they are so applicable to so many of our difficult situations today.
Yes.
So thank you for doing that. I think it sounds like it would be an incredible resource for people that do want to do sermons based on that.
I think so. We're all grappling for great sermon material. I just preached this past Sunday on the fishes and the loaves, and was often it's harder to find more progressive leaning exegetical material. And I drew from some of the very best, including Walter Brueggemann and Don Golden and Rob Bell and, some really, and some great liberationist writers who often didn't get their work out, to the public. I've always said we should take everything I learned in seminary with liberation feminist theologies and Oprahify it, make it popular, get it out there to everybody. So I do that in a really applicable way. And then at the end of each chapter are some discussion questions, actually. So I actually have volunteered to speak to any book group that wants me to, Zoom in and speak. And so I've been sitting down with some of the book groups, and it's been a really beautiful thing to see because people are finding their voice and they're learning how to speak about their faith in a whole new way. And it's been super empowering. And because I go through the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, it really gives people a different way to read the Bible that relates to this moment and can be very empowering.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I think before we started the interview, we identified several things for us to follow up on. I think now, after even talking to you more, I think I've got a few more ideas. So,
oh, good. This is fun work. I think of my sadness in coming out of seminary. I learned this beautiful theological, spiritual tradition of liberation theologies, and I found it under attack, actually, within our denominations. And I felt like we had this pearl of great price, but in my world, because I had moved into the mainline Protestant world and was seeking ordination in the Presbyterian Church, we had squashed our own voice. We had stopped having radio stations. We didn't have any sort of media outreach to external media that varied by denomination, but for the most part, we didn't have that kind of thrust. And I found that to be tragic and actually morally irresponsible, because I believe we do have a beautiful tradition, and unless we speak up about it, then others will misrepresent it, and that's incredibly spiritually damaging, but damaging to our public life as well.
Well, in addition to your book, Diana Butler Bass just wrote a book called Freeing Jesus that is similar in that, it looks at reclaiming the Bible from a more progressive perspective. And, I think, they're both role models of, how the rest of us can, follow and gain strength, I guess, and cohesion around what kind of used to be and should be, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, Diana's been doing this work for a long, long time. I'm so grateful for her books. I think she did a People's History of Christianity a long time ago. And then I've been drawing off her book, Grateful, which, even though it's about the spiritual discipline of gratitude, it's also got, a chapter on how that applies to public life and how it relates. So I can't wait to read Freeing Jesus. And I've talked to her recently, so she and I ought to get together and do some events potentially or something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in terms of looking forward, do you have any future books or other kinds of writing that you're ready to talk about yet, or is it too premature?
Well, I do want to do some more writing. I mean, this was so I had written a book about the Christian right itself and how it was organizing globally, which was more of an academic book. This is my first foray into spiritual literature. And I learned that I had a little bit of a gift for kind of storytelling in terms of retelling these biblical stories. That's the thing that people like most about the book, is my imaginative. It reminds me of, I guess, Sue Monk Kidd writes in this vein. It's historical fiction, basically. And so I embellished the story a bit to sort of help people see what it was all about and get us out of the boxes that we might have been taught things as in our childhoods. And so I might do a spiritual memoir next, or who knows? I'm still thinking about it, but I definitely want to write some more.
Good. And then what about on the front from a faith and public life perspective? What's new there?
Oh, yeah. So we're still in a moment of crisis as a nation, as I'm sure everybody understands, both with COVID, the COVID pandemic, the pandemic of racism, which has been with us from the founding of the country, and these attacks on our democracy. And the attacks on our democracy can sound abstract, but their life and death matters, because who we represents us. These folks decide whether or not we get health care, whether they dismantle Obamacare, or whether, my home state of Georgia and about 20 other states have not expanded Medicaid, which was one of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. And that means that millions of people around this country don't have health care that should have health care. And that disproportionately impacts communities of color, but it also impacts low-income white communities. My cousin, who works at Walmart and lives in Dalton, Georgia, which is a very depressed area of the state, used to be thriving, but has, had some industries fail. He does not have health care insurance, and these part-time jobs aren't providing him that, nor are they providing a living wage. And so this hurts all of us, to have people who have been bought off by corporate powers that be, the Koch brothers and others, who want to deregulate and kill our environment and our climate and lead to climate change, and the healthcare industry, which is enriching themselves off people's lives. So we're working very hard right now to pass the For the People Act, which would get corrupt money out of politics, which would dismantle all of these recent laws that were passed that will basically make it easier for someone like Trump or Trump himself to do what he was trying to do, which was to hijack the election. And he certainly has discredited the results. So, those kinds of lies shouldn't be told in a democracy. We should have a level playing field. And it's a moral issue because it's about human dignity. The right to vote is sacred. Everybody deserves a voice. So that's what we're working on very hard right now. We have networks in Georgia, in Florida, and Ohio, which are places that have been passing these laws, and we're working on the federal legislation as well.
Wow, good for you. If the federal legislation goes through as it stands right now, will that nullify that Supreme Court ruling that allowed corporations to make contributions, more than people?
Yes, it actually remedies that. And it makes things much more transparent, has a whole section around money in politics and getting corrupt and dark money out of politics.
That alone would be so huge. I mean, there's lots of other issues too about, voting access and things like that. But the money aspect of it is just overwhelming right now, I think. Big
money should not control our democracy. And we're moving toward an oligarchy in this country. We have been for a long time. We've got to reverse that. And it's an international issue now, going back to my roots. Autocracy is arising around the world. It's a global epidemic of autocracy, and a lot of it is being funded by autocratic leaders who have an affinity for one another and are also, more like crime rings than anything else. So if you look at like Putin and his affection between Trump and Putin and Erdogan and Turkey, they're all teaming up basically to control the resources of the world. So what we do here in America is going to impact everything around the globe as well.
Absolutely. Well, good for you. And thank you for all the work that you've done. And let's just hope that it grows and it continues to be increasingly effective.
I think so. We have 50,000 religious communities and leaders working with us now. So that does my heart good to see how many people are really stepping up to the plate.
Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us and sharing more about your book and more about your work. It's just thrilling to hear. And so thank you for these incredible contributions.
And thank you so much for getting the word out. And I look forward to working with you. This has been really fun.
Same here, Jennifer. Thank you.